In the summer of 1997, the world's most famous technology company was exactly 90 days away from total bankruptcy. Apple wasn't just losing market share. They were burning through hundreds of millions of dollars in cash, watching their operating system collapse under technical glitches, and quietly preparing for what seemed like the inevitable end. Michael Dell, the founder of Dell Computers, was asked in a live interview what he would do if he ran Apple. His answer was brutal and immediate. He said he would shut the company down and give the money back to the shareholders. To the entire business world, Apple was a walking corpse, a relic of the early personal computer era that had completely lost its way. Yet today, Apple is the most valuable publicly traded company on planet Earth, with a market valuation measured in trillions of dollars. This is the dramatic story of the corporate mistake that nearly destroyed Apple, the frantic race against time to prevent liquidation, and the unexpected alliance that saved the company from disappearing forever. To understand how Apple reached the edge of the abyss, we have to look back at 1985, the year the company made its most devastating decision. Following a bitter internal power struggle between Apple's 29-year-old co-founder, Steve Jobs, and its hand-picked chief executive, John Sculley, Apple's board of directors made their choice. They stripped Jobs of all operational authority and forced him out of the company he had built in his parents' garage. At first, Apple seemed fine. In the late 1980s, the company rode the momentum of the Macintosh, charging exorbitant premium prices for its hardware. But without Jobs' uncompromising product vision, the corporate leadership fell into a dangerous corporate trap. They chose short-term quarterly profits over long-term technological innovation. By the early 1990s, Apple's product line had exploded into a confusing, chaotic mess. Instead of building a few groundbreaking computers, the company was releasing dozens of nearly identical models with cryptic names like the Quadra, the Performa, and the Centris. Customers had no idea which machine to buy, and Apple's own retail sales reps couldn't explain the differences. Even worse, Apple began chasing random consumer trends. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars developing CD players, digital cameras, handheld electronic organizers like the Newton, and even a disastrous video game console called the Pippin. Almost all of them bombed in the marketplace. While Apple was busy confusing its customers with dozens of mediocre gadgets, a massive storm was brewing in Redmond, Washington. In 1995, Bill Gates and Microsoft launched Windows 95. It was sleek, accessible, and backed by a global software monopoly. Overnight, the personal computer market unified around Windows, leaving Apple's proprietary system completely isolated. Apple's operating system was outdated, frequently crashed, and was decades behind the competition. By 1996, the financial bleeding was catastrophic. Apple recorded a staggering loss of over $1 billion in a single fiscal year. Their cash reserves were evaporating by tens of millions of dollars every single month. The board fired CEO after CEO, but the stock continued its relentless freefall. Apple's new chief executive, Gil Amelio, realized the company had reached a dead end. Apple's engineers could not fix their broken operating system in time to save the business. The only way to survive was to buy an existing operating system from an outside company. Amelio evaluated several software startups, but one stood out above all the rest, a company called Next. Next was founded by none other than Steve Jobs after he was fired from Apple 11 years earlier. In December 1996, Apple officially acquired Next for $400 million. With that single transaction, Steve Jobs walked back through the doors of Apple as an informal corporate advisor. What Jobs found inside Apple horrified him. The company had zero strategic focus, morale was completely destroyed, and accounting showed that Apple had barely enough cash to make payroll for another 90 days. Seeing that Gil Amelio had no viable turnaround plan, Jobs orchestrated a boardroom coup, convincing the directors to oust Amelio. In July of 1997, Steve Jobs was named the interim CEO of Apple. He immediately launched a ruthless campaign to stop the financial bleeding. Jobs called Apple's top executives and engineering leads into a boardroom, walked up to a whiteboard, and drew a simple 2x2 grid. Across the top, he wrote two words, consumer and professional. Down the side, he wrote desktop and portable. Jobs looked at his team and delivered an ultimatum. Apple would stop producing dozens of redundant products. They were going to make only 4 great computers, one for each square of the grid. Everything else had to die. Jobs canceled over 70% of Apple's active hardware projects overnight, including the Newton and several printer divisions, laying off over 3,000 employees to slash operating costs. But while cutting costs stopped the immediate bleeding, Apple still had one fatal problem that threatened to kill them. They were completely out of money. To get the cash needed to survive, Jobs had to swallow his pride and do the unthinkable. Make a deal with his fiercest enemy. Jobs picked up the phone and called Bill Gates. At the time, Apple was suing Microsoft for allegedly copying the look and feel of the Macintosh system in Windows. Jobs offered Gates a deal. Apple would drop all existing patent lawsuits if Microsoft agreed to invest $150 million directly into non-voting Apple stock and commit to developing Microsoft Office for the Mac for the next 5 years. Gates agreed. For Microsoft, keeping Apple alive was a strategic masterstroke that helped alleviate growing antitrust scrutiny from the United States government. For Apple, that $150 million lifeline provided the exact financial cushion they needed to finish their next generation of hardware. In August of 1997, at the Macworld Expo in Boston, Jobs walked onto the stage to announce the Microsoft partnership. When Bill Gates' giant face appeared on the giant video screen via satellite, the die-hard Apple crowd erupted into furious boos and jeers. Jobs silenced the audience with words that redefined Silicon Valley. He told them that for Apple to win, Apple did not have to see Microsoft lose. Apple had to focus on doing good work, making great products, and remembering why people fell in love with the brand in the first place. With bankruptcy averted, Jobs and chief designer Johnny Ive locked themselves away to create a computer that would shock the industry. In May of 1998, Apple unveiled the original iMac, a translucent, teardrop-shaped machine in Bondi blue that eliminated floppy disk drives and embraced the internet. The iMac became an immediate global sensation, selling nearly 800,000 units in its first 5 months. It restored Apple's profitability and paved the runway for a golden decade of consumer tech disruption. The iPod in 2001, the iTunes Store in 2003, and the iPhone in 2007. The near-death experience of 1997 remains the greatest turnaround in modern corporate history. Apple didn't survive by doing more things. They survived by having the courage to strip away everything that didn't matter and focus entirely on simplicity. If Apple had not made that desperate deal with Microsoft, would modern tech look completely different today? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories behind the biggest moves in business history.